what we have here is a panel, and we have Mark Brousseau, who's from EPCOR up in Canada. And I'm going to give each of them a chance just to kind of talk a few minutes about what they do and, you know, how they see this issue. Ricky Eckhart, who was in the last window in a different seat. No, I guess you're still, we're like 4-3. So,
on the right seat.
Yeah, that's right. Still on the right seat. Dennis Reitz. Reitz. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
We changed the original German at some point in my family's history.
Did you really? Because it normally is pronounced E-I, is right,
yeah.
right? Correct. Okay. Okay. Just so I'm not wrong. But anyhow, he's with Takeda Pharmaceuticals, excuse me. And then John Custamano, who's with Deloitte. And John's very well known, I think, in the community, IT cybersecurity community from his past work. So with that said, I'm going to give each of them a few minutes just to comment on the topic and what they see as the issues, what they're kind of doing about it. And enough said. You can tell I'm tired of talking. So, Mark, do you want to start? I'll let you start.
Okay, great. Well, Mark Brousseau, as mentioned, from Canada. Basically, I'm a part of a utility, water and wastewater utility, so I'm sort of the senior manager responsible for the control systems there as well as the cybersecurity. And it was an interesting topic because I'd like to be able to say I've got this long list of all the things that Sid just went through, saying he did all of these things in evaluations, and we sort of backed into something, and I'm going to share exactly how we ended up where we did, which is a little different than the long process. I mean, anything with a 4-letter acronym should really have a lot of more discussion around it than I had, but based on it. So a few years ago, 5 years ago, I hired my first cybersecurity manager in the OT world. I'd always had sort of a controls group that was responsible for controls engineers, and then basically we did the design and implementation, operational support, and then I had also what I called either SIS or SCADA information systems, basically, and the SCADA informations people were basically people trained in the IT world, right? Because I've never gone with just sort of saying we're going to try to train engineers to do IT stuff. So I always had people on both sides. I had the two teams. But in the last few years, as many of you can attest to, we've just gotten so much more involved in all the different opportunities that are out there to address regarding cybersecurity that we had to do something different. So I hired a cybersecurity manager, my first one in the 25 years of leading controls groups in different organizations that I've been a part of, and basically put him in place to actually address some of the things that were coming up. I kept having to be called up to, every time something happened, all of a sudden the board of directors for EPCOR was interested in talking to me. I remember the good old days when they didn't know who the IT guy was, or the OT guy was, right? They didn't know my name and had never spoken to me, and I get to write them, reports on a regular basis now, as well as get to visit them at least once a year on things, or if something like Oldsmar happens, I get to talk to them even more closely about, could that happen in our water plants, right? So with all of those things happening, I really needed somebody in place. And so we brought it in and we started to implement tools. So we're running Nozomi for asset management. We had CyberX, and then of course Microsoft bought CyberX, which then means that a water utility can't afford it anymore. So that was part of the problem. So it went away. But we had other tools that we've been using SCADA fence and those kind of things. We're doing a monitoring for the Edmonton location. Edmonton's a city of we service about 1 million people, just over 1 million people with water, wastewater. We also have regional sites in Alberta, and we also have some sites in Ontario that we're supporting. And a new one that's coming on stream, a water plant for a nuclear facility, Darlington, which will has some interesting cybersecurity implications with it, as you can imagine. So with all of this said, we implemented the tools, and we implemented using basically a company called Glasshouse Systems out of Toronto. They also have an American division, but a smaller organization. But they helped us implement some of the tools, and basically, as we went along, as we grew in cybersecurity monitoring across the organization, my team of 2 people somehow couldn't keep up anymore for some reason with all the stuff coming in. How do we get the rules set up? How do we follow up on some of these things? How do we make sure that this data coming in is actually meaningful and we're actually using it for something, right? And so we started to lean more on them, and we signed an agreement with them to actually help my team. And it's one of those things where you go to your cybersecurity manager who you hired, who used to have responsibility for this, and you say, I'm going to take part of your job away, and you expect him to say, why, right? But he didn't. He said, thank you. And he said, let's work together. So we work I've outsourced it in a sense of what the terminology you're using said, but in the same time, I feel like we've sort of partnered with this group. We've really had some great resources. They've really helped my team mature because they're doing this all the time in a broader spectrum. And so they can come and help us refine our rules and our SIM. We're using QRadar as our SIM product, to bring all of it data from the different control systems into it, and go from there. So it's been a great partnership, a great opportunity, something I would have never expected. Way back when, I thought my team was going to grow and we're going to be able to keep up, but there was just no way. So that's how we solve the people problem.
Or are solving. solved. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ricky Eckhart, ExxonMobil Industrial IT Cybersecurity Manager. So very interesting. So SIS in our world is a safety intermittent system. So when you said that, my ears perked up pretty quickly. But it's interesting how we have different acronyms around the industry still.
I started calling them OTIS, Otis people, and then they said, we don't want to be called an elevator company. So
Exactly,
sorry.
yeah. So you have to come to some type of compromise. So my organization is focused on doing forensics, data analysis, threat hunting, and investigations from an OT cybersecurity perspective. And so we have people in Houston, Budapest, and Malaysia, and we're growing those footprints globally. So effectively, those individuals will be our virtual security operations center, and they're partnered up in the same locations as our enterprise security operations center analyst from a cybersecurity standpoint. So we're purposefully growing in the same location globally that our enterprise cybersecurity experts are located. So the way that we're staffing it right now is we're internally staffing it, and that's the plan going forward for a period of time. But we have a mix of skills. We have some folks that come from the field, primarily in our upstream businesses, that are have field experience, so control system engineers that we bring into the team to really create that domain knowledge. We have a few of those folks in Houston. We have somebody from our engineering organization that supported our downstream facilities from a control system perspective in Malaysia. Budapest, frankly, has been very difficult to grow in from a skill set standpoint. The market over there, we've not been able to attract experienced hires with the right skill sets. So over there, we're really looking for more network security, cybersecurity type skills, more of that IT flavor of cybersecurity. But our approach is going to be to establish a foundation of competency in those three locations, Houston, Budapest, and Malaysia. Once we have that foundation of competency established and really some mature processes in how we do cyber investigations from an OT perspective, that would be the point in time in my head that we would potentially evaluate looking for alternative staffing opportunities. So right now, our approach from an ExxonMobil perspective in this space is internally sourcing these teams globally, again, trying to pull from domain experience from the field where we can, and then also bring in some experienced hires in the market where it makes sense as well.
Cool. All right. I'm Dennis Reitz from Takeda Pharmaceuticals. I'm the head of manufacturing lab security there. And I'll kind of start by giving you guys kind of an orbital viewpoint of really our overall what we've gone through in the past 4 to 5 years. We started about 5 years ago, and this was actually as a result of the incidents that had happened in our industry at Merck, right? The security incidents. And so there was obviously that raised awareness, and we began an initiative which started as a small project at the time to, hey, let's make sure we segment our networks in the OT environments. And well, we quickly realized it's going to be a ton more than that. So we went on and we went through a lot of the steps you had talked about up there, right? We had assessments. We went through an implementation phase with this, and we're still in the midst of the tail end of that. And we're, kind of moving on into more of the support phase of things. And so really when it comes to that, what we started out with was even a couple of years ago, we actually did an RFP we figured we'll bring in a separate MSSP to do the OT pieces of this, right? And it turned out there weren't a lot of vendors in the industry that would do all of them, and we kind of break it down into 3 things, right? Incident response, threat intel and vuln, and then really the platform support for all our security platforms, right? There weren't a lot of vendors at the time that would do all 3 of those. And so ultimately, we actually landed on our existing IT security vendor that we were working with at the time to do the same thing for us in OT. Fast forward a couple of years, that turned into, well, if it's the same vendor, we can consolidate the teams into one, which I wasn't necessarily a huge advocate of, but I saw, well, okay, there were some advantages to that. Fast forward a little bit more, we had some budget cuts, and that team has now shrunk down to even smaller than it used to be. So one of the things that we're facing now as we reach towards the end of our program, our long program, is where do we want this to land, right? Where do we actually finally want to go with this? On top of that, as a side note, the vendor we went with got out of that business So we actually began insourcing a lot of those same folks. A lot of them were, ultimately badge flips, but we actually lost quite a few people there. So we're struggling in the same boat now, and we're trying to say where should we land and what's that happy medium for OT. So.
Okay, John?
Good. John Cusimano, and as Sid mentioned, I'm with Deloitte. So a little bit of the odd man out on this panel, in that I'm not with an end user, but I want to give a little bit of background. So I started my career with an end user. I started in the chemical sector, implementing control and safety systems for many years, and then moved into to working. I worked for a couple of vendors, and then I about 15 years ago, I moved into industrial cybersecurity consulting field. Pre-Stuxnet, so it was I'm early adopter, I guess you could say. In fact, my prior job, I'd worked for Siemens, but I left before Stuxnet incident, so had nothing to do with that, of course. But the interesting part of my career has taken me a lot of different areas, and so I've been in this field now for about 14, 15 years. And last year I was at a security conference and I was introduced to somebody and they said, "Oh, I know John. He's one of the OGs in cybersecurity." And not being too hip, I didn't know what OG meant. So I texted my daughter. I'm like, "Is that old guy?" She said, "No, original gangster."
Oh.
So I guess I've been in this field for a while. So I'm going to frame my comments today from that perspective of somebody who's been in the space for a number of years in the ICS cybersecurity space. So as everybody has said, we've seen the need for cybersecurity services evolve over the years, particularly as organizations evolve in their maturity. Almost always starts with assessments, try to figure out where are we at, what are the risks we're facing, what is the roadmap that we should put in place, what kind of program governance do we need to put in place. A lot of building the foundation, and that's what's occurred a lot over these last 10, 15 years, depending on the company's level of maturity. The last 5 or so years, I think we've seen a lot more implementation, particularly as the shiny new object syndrome, with a lot of new technology coming into the space that's being adopted, that has to be implemented and deployed, usually on a global scale. And that's obviously a big undertaking to do that. So a lot of services around that. But now we are seeing companies that are starting to move to that maturity level where now they need run and maintain services. We put all this infrastructure in place. Now we know all the assets we have on our OT systems, and that might be a little overwhelming. We know all the vulnerabilities, or many of the vulnerabilities. That's definitely overwhelming. And so what do we do with all this, and how do we manage this? We put all this technology in. We want to get the most out of this technology. Obviously, there's certain things that you have to do yourself, and very important, I think, to do yourself. But there are services you can outsource to third parties to help manage all of that data.
Okay. Are there things that on my slide that I missed? I mean, I shared my slides.
Go back to your table, Sid, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
So I want to, a couple of comments, kind of build off of John's statements. No, the slide with the table. We had assessment.
Oh, yeah.
So
this is my market study on. We have a market study I did on cybersecurity services. That's the breakdown.
So, and we do independent external assessments. So when we do bring in a third party to do that, we do that on a periodic basis, every 2 years or so. We'll have an RFP. We'll send it out to some subject matter expert companies in this space, and they come in and do an independent assessment of our capabilities and maturity from an OT cyber standpoint. So from that perspective, we are leveraging knowledgeable folks like where John works from the Deloitte perspective. We've currently in-house sourced the design and implement, and then the kind of the cyber practicality of doing forensics and threat hunting. But I agree with John. As we gain more maturity and foundational competency, we do eventually want to evaluate, is there an alternative approach? Because where we're at on our journey, we have a significant ICS footprint within ExxonMobil that span all the business functions, refining chemicals, all of our midstream areas, pipeline, lubes, fuels, terminals, and then all the upstream facilities, including our unconventional assets. there's a lot of variation. There's a lot of infrastructure out there that we're trying to get our hooks in to monitor. Whenever we start to collect all the data that we're going after, it's going to generate a significant amount of work and opportunity. Going back to the shiny object comments that I was making in the prior one, we have some pilots where we've deployed some quote unquote shiny objects by certain suppliers that may or may not be here, and generate a lot of noise, a lot of work to follow up on. And so, and we did that at a small scale. So if we were to amplify that or scale that capability out, that's when some of our peers within the oil and gas industry have started to reach out to companies to say, hey, can you help us with this? Mm-hmm. And so we're not at that level yet. We're still in a deployment and building a capability around this space. But to John's point, whenever we get to a certain level of maturity, we should always be evaluating alternative staffing opportunities.
What kind of companies have you used to do what kind of companies did, like you mentioned, having external people do assessments? Yep. Who do you go for? I mean, there's lots of choices. I know, I'm trying to frame it, but a lot of people go to their automation companies, for example. I mean, if you look at Siemens or the ABBs, that a lot of their business comes from assessments. Yep. For people who have their systems. A common thing I see in industrial cybersecurity is most companies will go to their vendors. They expect their vendors to provide security, but they'll go back to the vendors to make sure they get validation for everything they do. They have this relationship. So, I mean, is that the kind you're talking about, or is it somebody who does more independently?
More independence. I mean, the challenge with going to the vendors is they may tell you what you want to hear versus what you need to hear. Oh. So we have an independent verification process. So we submit a request for information to about 5 vendors on every 2 years. So the last time we did one, we actually utilized Deloitte. The time before that was Booz Allen Hamilton. But we typically look at the big consulting firms that have an established OT cybersecurity practice.
Okay.
Yeah, I can kind of echo that. I mean, from our perspective, we were building something right from the beginning, right? So it was brand new, and one of the first things that we did is we were working with Deloitte, and we brought them in and began to develop, based on industry standard frameworks and everything, kind of what we call our blueprint, which is really a Takeda specific framework, right? How do we want to do OT security? I should say OT and lab security, because that's really the area that I'm in. But then we went right into a whole, couple year assessment program where we went in and based on that blueprint that we had developed then, we worked with Deloitte to go out and say, okay, let's evaluate our sites against that blueprint. They had weren't building themselves to it, but that's what we did. And, we've developed what we call kind of for the future a self-assessment model. I mean, one of the biggest things that we did over this time, and in my opinion, one of the most important things we could have done was establish relationships with these sites, right? It is all about the relationships. They're very independent sites. They were from the beginning. They did their own thing. We established those relationships. So what we're hoping is in the future, a lot of this can be, hey, we'll work with our contact at the site, and can you update this information for us, right? We'll have it out there. And then periodically we may look at bringing in, Deloitte or somebody to come in and go, okay, let's update our assessment, or let's actually have you do a formal assessment again, so.
Yeah, one of the interesting things we had, I talked previously about partnering with somebody, outsourcing some of our information from our systems, but that partnership was based on a level of trust, and it goes back to relationship we built. Yeah. We had Digital Boundary Group come in and do a live fire test on our OT systems to determine if they actually put anything through our system, would we be able to pick up on it, right? And so they did our test of our SIM, and actually it's a group that we had trusted. They had done the IT in the organization. We have an IT OT governance council that I'm a part of. So on the console, there's basically water, electricity, other divisions all sit on the council, and part of it was looking at references that they had, and so they had used the Digital Boundary Group as a reference for the IT side. They also have an OT division, and so the OT division came in, did the live fire test on our SIM implementation, and actually they were the kind of group that they're the kind that don't come in and audit you against your standard. Like we have a standard that we reference internally as against the NIST 882 standard, and we say these are the things that we do. And our internal audit groups actually audit us against that standard. They came in years ago and tried to audit us against the IT standard, which was, of course, a really interesting couple of weeks. And then we convinced them at the end of those 2 weeks, this doesn't apply in our world. You have to use an OT standard, and then we actually work with them to build an OT standard that they evaluated us against. But bringing in a digital boundary group, those are the guys that basically, they'll come in and they'll throw a blanket over your security fence and actually climb over and show you how easy it is to get into your facility from a physical thing and how easy it is to copy card swipes and stuff. So they're not trying to audit you against basically what a standard is or anything. They're auditing you against what the real world hackers will actually do to get into your place, right? And so we represented that. We built a relationship with them. And then when they came in and said, the guys who put in this system for you did a great job. We haven't seen this. We would recommend them. And we've never heard that from them before. So when I turned around to say, who do I want to go out and work with to actually help us, because we don't have the internal resources to evaluate that, we built that relationship. And it goes back to, what have you done in the past with these people? How have they proven yourself? Do you have a relationship with them? Is it someone you can trust? Is it someone who has resources that aren't moving through their organization and changing every time? Yeah, we've actually called the same person for over a year and they're still there. And those are the kinds of things that we looked at as important to us when you're going to talk with somebody. So.
I've seen the same thing happen, particularly like with systems integrators. System integrators tend to have very close relationships, particularly regional ones, small regional ones, with the people they've done work for. And you do trust them. And so they'll come and they'll say, well, we can do cybersecurity assessments for you. And maybe they can, but you don't know how much they know cybersecurity-wise versus how much they know equipment. I'm not saying they do or don't, but it's hard to judge that, I would think. But that's the one where you have that relationship and you go to them, and hopefully it pans out well. I mean, they can deliver on what they said. I just wonder how that would be.
I could make a few comments on assessments. Regardless of who you choose to use for your assessments, it's really important as an organization that you spend a little bit of time putting together a good specification for what you're looking for. Because what I've seen, if you go to 10 different vendors for an assessment, you'll get 10 different bids and 10 different flavors of assessment. There's no real standard. There are standards, but there's no single approach. So, for example, there are gap and maturity assessments, there's vulnerability assessments, there's risk assessments, and there's even penetration testing, which you could argue is a form of assessment. So before you go, you put out your RFI or RFP, you just make sure you spend some time thinking about what do we want to learn from this assessment? Do we want to know how compliant we are, or do we want to know where our risks are and how do we address those? Those are the types of questions you want to ask yourself, and put together a good specification so that when you get your proposals back, at least they should all be addressing your needs rather than offering you their form of assessment, which may or may not fit your needs.
That's a good point. We probably had some learning opportunities from that engagement process with you guys. But we also do penetration testing for certain business lines within our L3 environment. And we do that internally. We have a red team within ExxonMobil that would go out and do some penetration testing, some vulnerability assessments of certain business lines, L3 networks. So we don't do that across all the business lines. We don't do that consistently at this point. We're trying to gain the trust and the momentum so we can do it across all the business lines in a more consistent manner. So that's something that we also source internally as well.
Any questions out there? Go ahead, Michelle. Better they ask the question.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Again, I love the content and what you guys are talking about. Do you feel that there's a need for systematic approach from assessment to audit and using systems to be able to do that in comparison to doing, snapshot in time assessments?
So from like a vulnerability perspective to
from a vulnerability or a risk-based assessment, really what I'm trying to get to is that IEC 62443 defines a cybersecurity management system, and that cybersecurity management system could be inferred to be something that is then taking a manual process like a risk assessment and moving it into a real-time TRA, which it would be a real-time threat risk analysis. Similar to where like the healthcare industry's done this about 10 years ago because of the Obama administration enforcing it on them, which is they went from snapshot in time assessments once every 2 years, like you talked about, or most of you guys talked about, through to then doing a real-time assessment of your environment and understanding where your environment is at any given point in time. Do you see that systematic approach, or are we still too early or not mature enough in the industry to be able to get there?
So I would love to have an approach like that, but I can speak for Exxon. We are definitely not there from a maturity or a capability perspective right now. But I would love to have a future state where we had that type of visibility, where we could flange up CVEs, that critical CVEs that come out with the exploitable vulnerability opportunities within the environment. Right now, that is a very manual process. Yeah. So we get the CVEs, and then we have to do analysis to determine where do we have this vulnerability, and is it exploitable within the architecture? And we can't just do it from a standard architecture perspective. We have to go in and say, okay, we know our architecture standard is X, but there's going to be variation for how that architecture is implemented across all of our global sites. So because of that variation, does that make some of these vulnerabilities exploitable? So therefore we need to take immediate action, or do we feel that we have the appropriate barriers or mitigations in place? So maybe it's our periodic patch process will catch it up. So right now, that's a very manually intensive process across all of our ICS environments and business functions. Ideally, in some type of future state, we could have all that data extracted from the ICS environment so we can run that analysis from a CVE perspective and really understand where we have vulnerabilities that could be exploitable, so we need to go do something about it.
Isn't
much smaller, and I'm dwarfed, yeah. So basically, within our environment, it's exactly the same sort of thing. We have tools that'll tell us, that CVEs, we have asset tools that tell us this is what we have, and so we know the things, but we have windows where we patch like quarterly basis, et cetera, those kind of things. So in a sense of, it's not a real-time environment, certainly even the tools that we're doing. When it comes to actually assessing our systems, we have a yearly assessment that we as an organization go through with IT, so IT, OT. We're using C2M2 and basically as our tool of assessment overall. Some real challenges with C2M2 from my perspective when you look at it in the OT world. There are some questions that just don't apply in the OT world in the same way they would apply in the IT world. So we're having to fudge answers, and it used to be easier, but when you use their new PDF version, they now tell you, before we actually built a set of okay, in the OT world, when C2M2 asks you this, what they actually mean is, do you do this, right? And we could do that with that. But now with the new tool, it says, no, you have to actually follow their style, and basically here's what it means to you. And we sit there and say, well, that's really nice in an IT world, but it doesn't apply to us at all. So how do we answer this question as we're trying to be evaluated before I go to the board of directors and say, yeah, I'm only at mill level 0.5 in my system, but that's because the assessment doesn't really reflect an OT environment, or do I fudge the number and say, yeah, I'm fully compliant with that, when really I'm not because it doesn't apply. So those are the challenges with some of the assessments. That's one of the things I came here hoping to hear from other folks. What are you using to assess your cyber maturity in your organizations? Because it's a challenge when you go across IT, OT. Like we have the governance council, which is great because we can go up to there and arm wrestle and actually get along with the IT folks, which is, I think, a tremendous, for an old OT guy, that's a tremendous step forward to actually be able to talk to them. And the IT folks, when they go into as I said, the board of directors, they like to bring some OT folks along, and I'm usually one of those. So it's been helpful. But when it comes to assessing in the two worlds, they really want to push some tools, and they don't understand when we say this doesn't apply to our world. So yeah, and we do that assessment typically once a year, okay, from that perspective. So
yeah, it's interesting to kind of hear those perspectives, because I mean, I agree. I mean, we're, in our situation, right, we're not to the point where we could automate that type of stuff. And quite frankly, I mean, while that would be ideal, I'm just thinking for myself, I mean, there's a lot more we would need to do just to clean up our environment to be able to automate that with a degree of confidence that we're not going to break something, because, oh, look, it said this isn't an issue, or yet it was, right? Or it tried to do this and that failed. So, from that perspective, it's really interesting. And you had mentioned the patches, quarterly patching and everything. And the IT versus OT, I mean, my team's in an interesting position because we're kind of bridging that gap, right? We're trying to bring the IT folks to the table to say, okay, slow down. You've got a lot of good ideas and good stuff, but slow down with what you can do in OT. And we're also trying to bring the OT folks to the table and go, IT is not your enemy, right? We're gonna do this, but we're gonna do it your way, and we're gonna make sure that this works for you. So it's interesting because I love the idea of being able to say, oh, here's the vulnerabilities, and because we know this is segmented off in this way, it doesn't even hit a list then, right? It just sits in a database somewhere and goes, it's really not a vulnerability. It's automatically been remediated, but we're just not there.
Yeah, so certainly the holy grail would be to get to some kind of a continuous risk assessment, risk dashboard that actually reflected the real operating environment. But yeah, definitely easier said than done. There's definitely some really cool work being done in the space by some vendors to build. One thing you have to have is a model of the facility. And so what does it mean if there's this vulnerability? I've got 1,000 of these PLCs across my environment, and a new vulnerability, a 10 CVSS score vulnerability comes out. Do I need to patch them all immediately? Well, it probably depends. Where is it in the architecture? What's its function? Is it controlling, is it opening a door, or is it controlling a cat cracker? Big difference, right? So, one of the things that we're working on with some of our clients is we call it vulnerability rationalization, which is a methodology now more of a methodology than a tool. But the idea is to model your system so that when a new vulnerability comes in, you can rationalize it in terms of the context of your operations, and that kind of stuff has to come first. The processes and the methodologies for how would we do this, and then you can spin it up to be real time.
The word that you use is really critically important. Is context to operations and understanding the context, the risk approach that you're going to take to specific assets. It's not connected to particular assets.
Yeah.
Thank you for your answer.
Let me ask, I'm going to take this because I have the mic. But when you talk about I'll call them visibility solutions today, but the Clarities and the Zomies, the bunch, that group of companies, they started, I would say, because I've been following them for years. But the original thing was, we're going to monitor network traffic and tell you if something funny is happening. And I think there's value to that, but that's the thing that generates this massive amount of alarms and all that kind of stuff that overwhelms teams. But the other thing that came out of it in the end, backwards, which is now the main selling point, is in order to do that, they ended up doing started doing asset discovery, passive asset discovery. Then most of them now have active asset discovery, intelligent asset active. So they're not crazy people. They just don't send out pinging everything. They do it in a way. I'm telling you what they tell me. All right. I'm not endorsing or whatever. But a big problem I had always heard about assessments was the manpower it takes to go out and to get all the information from every asset. So I know these tools quite well, and I'm sitting here saying to myself, well, that should take care of a major step of the assessments, okay? So when I hear Ricky, for example, you're saying, I'm assuming, maybe I misunderstood too, but anyhow, not knowing what assets you have and stuff like that, I would assume that those kind of products would have been a natural solution for that. Now that's one aspect. Let me finish my whole thing. Then what happened with those companies, and again, I've been following them from the very beginning. Before there was a Clarity, they actually introduced it down here. But then they kind of went and said, wait a minute, since we now have the asset inventory, we know what's in that asset, and they started doing the CVs, managing the alerts. And then they do the matching for you. So I think that takes a lot of load off as well. Now, the one thing they don't have that's natural, it's the thing that came up with the context, is, yeah, okay, you can tell me this PLC needs this patch. You don't have it in some. It's questionable how deep they can go into systems and all that kind of stuff. But setting that aside, they still would say, okay, here's where you have vulnerabilities that are relevant to you. So they've taken the whole list and filtered it down to the ones relevant to you. Then many of them have added features for things like you give it some kind of a rating. I understand that's the difficult part here. Yeah. You end up saying this is a critical asset or not a critical asset, but it's more complicated than that. It's not a simple critical, not critical kind of a rating. So I guess my question, I was surprised that is, when you made a comment, Ricky, you just happened to mention, you said it's very labor intensive. And I was surprised to hear that. But apparently it is. So I guess my question is really, how valuable, how much value are you getting from these tools to help to do it? Because I'm sure Deloitte uses those kind of tools as part of an assessment. I'm only asking Deloitte because there's a Deloitte guy here, but I mean, all of the people are doing it.
So we use one of those tools. I won't say the supplier, but we
Okay.
use one of those tools. Pilot is probably too loose of a word, but we've deployed it to multiple facilities. And it can provide a perspective on inventory, but it's also limited to where you deploy it, right? And so at a refinery, as an example, we may have multiple network zones at that refinery that we would need to deploy that capability to. So then we need to have a discussion around, well, some of those zones could be critical control zones. So do we want to deploy something, even though it's a passive monitoring capability, do we want to deploy that? Or do you deploy it at the interface between that control zone and a monitoring zone? And then we have protective safety zones, or SISs.
Yeah, right.
The real ones, yeah.
Right.
So, it can, I think those tools can drive value if you deploy them in the right places at scale, but then just
Still blind spots, right?
there's still going to be blind spots. So what we also have a series going back to the PLC comment. We have PLCs all over the place that could be networked together in an isolated network or come into the control system network. And so then do we deploy like a Nozomi SCADA Guardian to all those different network segments so we can get that granularity of traffic? Because if you just tap into one interface of a firewall, as an example, you're not going to get the granularity of the inventory deeper down into the network stack. So yes, there's value, but then it comes into the cost of deployment, the scale of sustaining that capability, and it will provide a significant amount of information. And so can you turn that information into something useful?
I don't want to make a promotion for any company. I mean, even though they're a client of ours, but I do have to mention, because I think those companies are the one you mentioned, all right? But I do find as companies realize that is a major problem with the network scanning kind of solutions there's ones that are not visible, you can't get to them, especially cost effectively, okay? So they might say, well, we're going to use active polling. But I just want to mention, just so you're aware, and I would suggest you kind of check into it, is I'm going to say Nozomi again. Again, I'm not trying to make a promotion for Nozomi, it's just that they happen to come out with a new product they just released that I wrote something about, so I know the product. But
On the network device, the appliance on the network device.
The appliance on the network devices. And a major driver for that was to be able to get at more access to other things. Now, there's probably other issues with it, but deeper into that endpoints, but also the thing scans the east-west traffic. It's not just north-south. So anyhow, I think those are nice technological things moving ahead. I'll be frank, Nozomi or whoever listens to me here, I do question the thing, because a lot of them will come up with the risk scores and they'll tell you that they really can tell you all the risks. And you just know in your heart that that's not true. I mean, yeah, they can do things to make it better, but they're never going to be able to consider this thing of where this fits, what it's used for under certain circumstances.
And is it exploitable within the context of the architecture, right? Because it can, if we plug those types of capabilities into a lot of our control system networks, there'd be a whole lot of reds, right? But are those vulnerabilities exploitable within the architecture? That's where you have to go in and tune it and score it and all that.
And what's the consequence?
Absolutely. Because some of them could be exploitable, but it's of lower consequence. So it's like, yeah, we know about that. It's good to have a technical validation, but it could be a design parameter of that implementation.
Yeah, and it's a question of, is it exploitable, number one, and then number two, does it matter?
Yeah.
Right? A lot of times people say, who cares?
But to your first point, though, this technology definitely helps. Having these systems, whichever, doesn't matter which one, having them installed definitely makes the assessor's job easier because there's more data available. So we typically call those technology-enabled assessments. And we use lots of different tools. Everybody uses lots of different tools. It's really that aggregating all that data and then being aware that there are going to be blind spots in that data.
Yeah, and I was going to say, it's interesting because coming from our perspective, where we started, right? I mean, we had no visibility. 5 years ago, nothing. I mean, there were vulnerabilities, obviously, in the environments. As I said, every plant, every location, all those locations were just completely independent. We couldn't see anything. We didn't know what we were getting into. So we did. One of the first things we did as part of our large program was to deploy a tool like this. And we started getting just all this information. And, and the vendors are, every year they'll leapfrog each other. Who does this or who does that? I mean, and I'll outright say, because I think they're here and everything. Currently, we're using Armis. If we, at some point, reevaluate that, we might. But, it's been extremely helpful for us in exactly the areas you mentioned, right? We began to have the visibility. We could immediately see vulnerabilities. And, as we said, asset management, we didn't have a clue what we had. Each site had their own way of doing assets. And then we're like, hey, what are all these? And they weren't on your spreadsheet. Oh. Well, we forgot about those, or we didn't. I think we found a Nintendo Switch on one of our plant environment, and we're going, what? So we found all this information, and it's extremely useful. Now, what we're in the process of trying to do now is formalize this, right? And actually, okay, let's truly build the right processes around all this. But even in the short term, before we have all the formal processes, it has been extremely valuable. And I'm really excited to see where these vendors go in the future, quite frankly, because I think they could be the crux of the network, so to speak, or of this capability.
One other follow. I'm sorry, Mark, if you wanted to say something.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, I certainly agree, and just want to affirm that we learned a lot around our systems. We didn't find a Nintendo Switch, interesting, but we did find a couple of, somebody forgot that after the contractor had left that they still had a connection in for support services after the warranty period was over, those kind of things. So we found those kind of things, which of course nobody knew about. And so, yeah, so those tools are really helpful. Limitation though, like we have a DCS system in one of our plants, and of course you're really limited on what you can actually do. So, we're limited on actually being able to say how far can we extend our monitoring and our asset management. I mean, DCSs have their own asset management tools you can use and stuff, but the integration of that isn't easy. And we actually put in their SIM solution into our system, and it had to, people from the States don't often want to come up to Canada, and when they do, it's expensive because we have to pay them in American dollars instead of Canadian pesos, and so that's expensive for us. So when they come in, and we actually had to bring them up to actually set up the system and stuff, it was really expensive for us to actually do that, and from that perspective. So yeah, the implementation of it's a Cisco switch, but it's got the vendor's name on it, and it just doubled in price. And for a utility, that's really hard to handle. Hard for me to go back to the taxpayers in the local city and be able to say, yeah, I bought the switch, it cost twice as much, but now you're more cyber secure. It didn't work well. So anyway.
Yeah. Which we have a question out there, but I'll forget. So I just want to follow up with one last thing on this topic. The S-bombs were real popular here, particularly last year, maybe the year before. It became a big topic. And somebody made the comment, and I assume it seems appropriate to me, is he says, yeah, we could do that. We could go through and analyze all this stuff, and we would get even more information that we can't do anything with. So I'm just asking from the point of view for the feedback, maybe if there's anybody here from a Nozomi or an Armis or a company. Is there a limit to how much, this was more on the monitoring, the detection of the anomalies. But even from an asset inventory perspective, how much information can you really use? I mean, before you're overwhelming your team, which is kind of the focus of this session, you already have problems that you don't have enough people to do all the things that could be done. Like you said, could be done, but doesn't mean you have to do it.
Yeah, I don't know. From our perspective, and again, we're kind of in the middle of trying to decide this. There's a ton of information we're getting. But we're also looking and going, what do we really need? And it's not, in my mind, it just takes, it's overwhelming. And yes, it takes a project or whatever you want to call it, but you need to just sit down and wade through the info and go, okay, let's start from scratch. What do we need to see, right? What do we want? And then look at the vendor and go, can you feed this into whatever asset management system I'm using, right? And work to set that feed up and then set your alerts up and go from there. I think you just have to take it logically. I would still prefer to see more available information that they can provide than, well, we're going to limit it because it's too overwhelming for people. No. Make a nice interface, make it easy for us to have an API to grab it, but then let us decide what we want to see, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to go back real quick to the DCS comment, because we have been working with some of these vendors to make sure that their products are qualified by the DCS OEMs. And so there's been a lot of progress that's been made. You know, Honeywell, as an example, has a strategic alliance with Nozomi, which you know, we have a pretty significant Honeywell-based footprint in our manufacturing facilities. But we also have 5 other DCS OEM vendors that we work with from an upstream and midstream perspective. And so not all of these products are qualified for all those DCS vendors. And then some of our DCS systems are really old. And so even if the vendor has qualified it, it may not be on the version of the control system that we have. So again, there's value to these tools, but can we deploy them in a comprehensive manner to derive value?
We're doing something similar too. We're because, you know, obviously we'll run into and you get the various vendors, and nothing to them, but you know, you get somebody like, just as an example, like a Rockwell, right? They're going to come in and go, this is the way we want to set everything up for. These are the tools. These are the monitoring tools we use. We use it. Okay, yeah, but we've got a heterogeneous environment here, and I, as the company person, not the vendor, not any part of it, I want a single tool to look at, right? So I want all of the vendors out there to start working together, right? That's what I want. I don't want to have, you know, 4 different monitoring and data gathering tools, right? Come on, you want to do something right, vendors, the monitoring vendors, go get yourself certified with every one of the other vendors out there. And for the other vendors like the Rockwells, the Siemens, be willing to work with them to certify their products, right?
I have a quick
Yes, there's a question there.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for your insights. I think it's been a great conversation. My question is back to the managed services that you guys are expecting and just your expectation of your actual provider. I think for the majority of this discussion, you guys kind of touched on how, from a basic standpoint, you guys want to implement and do that internally, but as far as externally, it's on the analysis piece. So my question is, what exactly are you looking for? Are you looking for insights, or are you looking for the MSSP provider to actually implement the recommendations that they provide? And then specifically for John, Ricky mentioned that the independence of a Deloitte type consulting firm is attractive to them. And so from your perspective, like, how do you guys manage the fact that you guys don't actually own a lot of the assets, but are providing expertise in that space?
Is there a specific person you want to answer that?
Well, I guess the first half could be Mark,
Ricky?
Dennis, or Ricky, and then the second part of John.
Okay.
Go ahead, we're not using MSSPs.
I guess from our perspective, yeah, we were looking at someone who could take that information, who was probably more, who's doing it daily. And part of it, I have a team of 2 people, right? So basically a team doesn't want to be on 7x24 by 365, right? So I'm going to burn them out if they're following up on all the things that were coming in. So when it came to rule-based, they became the tier 2, right? So we have a tier 1, so they've got all the data, they're interfaced directly only to our SIM. That's the only thing they're interfaced to. And they're taking that information out, they're dealing it down, they're using the rules that we've agreed to and work with them on to say, what are the things that escalate up to a tier 2 level that we're gonna then look into? And so that's what we're using it for, is just that. So it's basically taking the information that we have, pulling it out, and actually turning the data into information, I should say, really, basically. And so that's what we're using them for. And basically that's the level of interface we have with them at this point. So they're also helping us on tuning the rules and systems in our SIM. So they look at things and saying, you know, if there's new things coming out, or new vulnerabilities, or new identifications, or new rules we should be implementing into our SIM, basically they're helping us on that kind of perspective, because, you know, they're involved with a bunch of other customers, and that's the advantage that they have, that, you know, we don't have the network of relationships that they do. And so from that perspective, they can come in, and they've made some great recommendations on things that we didn't have rules for in our SIM, that we weren't picking up. So we're looking at the rule setup that creates the offenses, and then once the offense is created, it's pulled into my team, and my team is one that basically goes through and investigates it, either using the cyber team or actually using those Otis guys. I won't call them SIS so I don't freak everybody out here, but those folks to actually look at saying what's happening in the field. You know, is there really a switch out there we didn't know about, right? So that's what they go looking for. So.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think from my perspective, and again, we had a unique situation because we were essentially forced into an insourcing model very quickly because the vendor we were using got out of the service. You know, if we go back to that, I mean, I think where I would draw the line is really at that layer 1, layer 2, you know, that tier 1, tier 2 support. I still think it comes up to our folks, and I'd rather have the decision making, you know, all of that trust level within the internal teams, right? I don't mind, you know, there's people sitting there watching the console and doing analysis on an issue or, you know, some type of vulnerability that comes up. Yes, feed us all that information, right? We have to be the ones to make the decision. I can't completely outsource that. I just, you know, with how complex our business and the interactions and the relationships are, to me, that's too much of a risk of a mistake being made, quite frankly.
Absolutely.
You know,
I
so.
agree.
Is that?
Would-
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
I was going to ask if you wouldn't mind repeating the second part of your question, 'cause I want to make sure I answer that correctly.
So, Sid asked about leveraging OT vendors for MSSP and the benefits of maybe not doing that with the consulting firm. And so I guess what I wanted you to comment on was just that, like the benefits of doing that, and if that idea of independence really is driving like OT asset owners to use consultants rather than OT vendors.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks for
Consultants being IT type MSSPs or
I think
consultants
you mean
Like
just
Deloitte
non-vendor.
or
non-
like a Deloitte or,
Yeah.
Yeah.
okay.
Okay, yeah, thanks for repeating that. That definitely helps. Sid had mentioned earlier, you know, one of the reasons not to use your vendors would be because you don't know, very few companies have just one vendor. They may have their main automation contractor or vendor that they use, but there's all kinds of ancillary systems. And if you want the big picture, the full picture, you should bring in some company, some firm that can look across all of that from an objective standpoint. So there's certainly that level of objectivity. So, you know, companies like Deloitte and other consulting firms typically are vendor neutral in our posture. And so when we come into an environment, or any company like ours comes into an environment, we would want to look at it from that perspective of vendor neutrality. Just we want to help us understand the entire OT ecosystem infrastructure and look at it very objectively from that standpoint, from a, you know, kind of non-biased viewpoint. Make recommendations. Very often the recommendations will best be served by the vendor. So if the recommendation is to make some change in your DCS system architecture or add some additional capabilities, they're typically best to be implemented by the DCS vendor in that case. But so I guess that's another reason for an objective viewpoint. So it's not, some companies have been accused of coming in to perform assessments to generate work for themselves. So that's, particularly vendors have been accused of that, whether they do or not. I'm not suggesting that, but so that's another reason for the objectivity, is so that whoever's coming in performing the assessment isn't trying to also possibly sell you more equipment or something like that too.
And I will say, just from the perspective of, we just use that, we're still, working with Deloitte on this, that point of view, that kind of neutral third-party point of view is extremely appreciated, right? Because it is, I don't have some vendor who, might be leaning their way or might be trying to sell me something. And not even that there's some malicious intent, it's just that's what they're going to try to do, right? Because that's what they're there for, right? It's having that third-party point of view where they're like, look, you've got a bunch of different options on what you can use or how you can do this. And that's been extremely valuable and extremely appreciated. So I think it is the right approach.
Yeah, I would echo that, and just another recognition for the work that John's been doing since he's joined Deloitte. I mean, Deloitte has really pulled together a very comprehensive OT cybersecurity team, and so there's a lot of experts that can come to bear with that vendor neutrality, and also looking at the full scope of an ICS environment, not just the DCS. I mean, there's a lot of opportunities right above the DCS in that level 3 space that can be implemented in various ways across the industry. And so somebody like a Deloitte or another consulting company would look at that from the full perspective of the environment and not just limit their perspective to the DCS.
Mm-hmm. Did we have another question?
Yeah, sorry, this is going to be more of a comment than a question, but I think I'll try to formalize a question by the end of what I state. Is that, Sid, you said earlier, is that how much data is enough data for the operations, and I think we have to really look at where the market space is today when you start to answer that question, which is we're at the tip of the iceberg relative to the use of data in business, meaning we're still using legacy systems that don't create that much data, and that we're moving to PLCs and RTUs that will create a hell of a lot more data than what we have today. And really the consequence of that is that our systems are overloading people, and that the people cannot keep up with the data. But if we look at the advances of machine learning and artificial intelligence, we will shift from a people thinking model to a machine learning model in the near future. Within the next few years, I would think that we would see this from the perspective of systems analysis to be able to see what a real risk is. And then at that point, we get away from the noise of all of these systems, and then we trim it right back down to what is the real risk to this system. But with that, what the members have said today is that it's a part of understanding how the systems operate, what the context of those systems are, what the consequences of the risk is. And with that, I think we'll move away from logging, like the logging data, into more operational data. And that operational data will give you more contextual data over the course of time. So what I've been trying to get the questions asked really is, are we moving to a world of CSMSs, which is cybersecurity management systems that then take into the consideration of this? Are we seeing this at the end user community, or am I thinking 10 years ahead of where the market space is today?
It's an interesting point of view too, because again, combined with your earlier question, right, around the, hey, what are with the data, and how are we doing the analytics and who should do it and everything. I hope to see that, right? I mean, the AI. I mean, you look at everything that's going on with AI right now. We could probably have about a 12-hour session just talking about that alone. But just in this area, I think that's the natural progression, right? Those AIs, they will get much better. Hopefully we can get to the point where we say, yeah, look, here is our architecture of this environment. And based on just the way industries have done this and the way that AI is learning, it can go, okay, well, if this and this and this are the case, then typically this isn't going to be an issue. And if it can begin to analyze your environment and your data like that, yeah, I look forward to the days when that happens, right?
Ricky, did you?
No.
No. Let me just follow up on something that you guys brought up before that I think may be obvious to you, but it wasn't obvious to me when I was thinking about this. The comment about tiers that Mark started, but he made the comment. Is that the most rational way to think of outsourcing your cybersecurity stuff? Because most companies, I mean, there is tier one being, I'm detecting problems, I guess. Tier two, more and more expertise is required. And I got that point that Dennis made there about you want to make sure that you are doing the things at a certain level, a certain tier of support level, because you want to be sure that your expertise or your company's expertise is involved in that. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know if anybody heard anything I was saying there. You can tell by my hand waving, though. I'm a good hand waver. No, I was just asking the question about tiers. Yeah, I can tell now you weren't hearing me. I was asking them, there was a comment earlier about tiers. Mark had mentioned about how he outsourced the tier one stuff, and Dennis had made the comment that Dennis made it, but anyhow, that they outsourced that, but then anything that person finds, tier one being the ones where, kind of like a help desk kind of a model is what I'm assuming you're using as a kind of a reference there, where you report your problem and they can take care of some basic things, but if it's a little more significant, it gets escalated and escalated and escalated at different levels. In this case, it may be detecting something. Maybe you have some people that detect stuff, but that doesn't necessarily mean they react to it because they don't have the context and the knowledge to do it. And I was just asking, what I was getting to was, I was asking if that's a way, in my slides, I had a point about types of services you might outsource. I was thinking more of the kinds of things, more thinking from a cost perspective and on-site requirements, that kind of stuff was in my mind, as opposed to the more natural, maybe more sensible thing is, wait a minute, my goal here is to take care of my cybersecurity, so I'm going to have some type of a tiered system to begin with. Maybe I could outsource that sense and to keep control. And I'm just curious if that is what the end users, if that's the kind of thinking you use when you choose to outsource, number one. And then maybe with John, if that's the kind of thing you're being asked for. Okay?
I mean, I guess I can make a couple comments on it. I mean, sure, we're probably oversimplifying it in the conversation, right? I mean, I look and I break it down, and there's the vertical and the horizontal way to break this down, right? So if I look at this from the the tiers are really the horizontal. Okay, yes, anything below this is gonna you can outsource. Anything of skills and knowledge above this you can outsource. But I also think if we look at that from a vertical perspective, it's just which pieces of that. Sure, I mean I think we'd have to take each bit and piece, step by step and go, okay, what are we talking about? We're talking about pure incident response. We're talking about, threat intel and vuln management. We're talking about platform support. We're talking about local hands-on support at sites and things like that. Totally, in my mind, those are different, and you would break them down differently. So yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, you could take the lowest levels and outsource them. Of all of those, much easier than everything else. As you go up the stack, in my mind, it's a stack by stack decision on, well, where do you draw the line, right?
I think you have to be careful when you talk about different levels of tiers.
Yeah.
So you think of tiers this way, but when I was talking about basically tickets being outsourced, you talked about a level 1 ticket being that, again, it's information.
Yeah.
We're passing information out, data and stuff, but we want to get back information that's going to give us actually, okay, what's happening in our system that we need to pay attention to, okay? And so we talk about levels of tickets. I'm not talking about tiers like from 0, 1, 2, 3, sort of the Purdue model tiers. I'm talking about basically a ticket level to say, we've got a ticket level, I'm passing information or data out to this group. They're taking the data, they're translating it into something that's actionable. And you're absolutely right. I'm not going to let anybody touch my system or evaluate. When they're coming back and saying this is a level 2 ticket, my team's going to go explore and say, what happened? Like we got some tickets raised because basically we're monitoring the drainage side just as a favor to them. And basically they had Digital Boundary Group come in and they were running tests on their system, and we picked it up on our systems, and our systems lit up, right, to say something's happening over there, right? And so my team went out and found out what was going on. Of course, it's like one side of the organization doesn't always talk to the others. We're doing a favor by monitoring their systems. They didn't tell us they had a group coming in to run tests on their system, but I mean, it was, again, one of those things, but that's the level of ticket. It's something they saw all this data coming in. They didn't try to tell us what to do. They just said, you guys got to go investigate something. Something's happening over there, and you should pay attention, and that's what we're doing.
And for clarification, that's also what I was referring to when I was talking about tiers. It wasn't Purdue model network or anything like that. It was really just support, for lack of a better common phrase, ticket levels or tier levels or skill levels, right?
Well, skill levels, that's
Skill,
when I've used the term in the past. I use it for skill, and very often I talk to companies, they'll take care of their basics things inside because they have a certain level of expertise. Now, some companies will then, if it's more complicated, they will escalate it up to maybe a corporate group where they have more cybersecurity. I'm talking about cybersecurity expertise here.
Yeah.
But that's quite different than, I've also seen a lot of consulting companies or service providers. Their agreements will say, we'll monitor your systems and we'll detect something. But the agreement is such that when we get it, we'll alert you about it. Then it's up to you to tell us what to do about it. I mean, you can form agreements however you like, I guess. But that involvement's there from the point of view of the ticket and evaluating the ticket. So.
Well, and not to dive too deeply into that, but you also have to be very clear when you're writing those contracts as to who is responsible for what. Because I don't know how many times I've seen this where there's a big gap. Oh, we thought you were doing this. No, we thought you were doing this. And then, who does the stuff in the middle, right? So you really got to detail that out.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Okay, so we have another question out there. I'm sorry for stepping on the people in the audience. Go ahead.
Hi, Sam Miarelli at Siemens Energy. So I was interested in the request that the vendors all work together. There's one DCS vendor that has pretty proudly told their investors that their cybersecurity business is to increase lock-in. And I think back
Increase what?
Lock-in.
To increase lock-in for their DCS.
Oh.
And I think back to both the big consulting firm written RFPs that I've seen come to us in the last few years. And I think of the big control system RFPs that have come back to us in the last few years. And the control system RFPs don't make this sort of interoperability a selection criteria. So there's no economic incentive on the control system vendor to have this interoperability. And the cybersecurity RFP says, well, you have to be able to get something that's certified by the DCS vendor, right? So this, yet again, is the owner creating lock-in for themselves.
Yeah, it's a challenge.
And so my question to the owners is, if you really want this out of your DCS and cybersecurity vendors, when will you tell your procurement departments? Because that's what really will get the reaction to this.
So I believe it's tomorrow or Wednesday. There's going to be a lot of discussion about open process automation. No, but I totally agree. I mean, it is a challenge, and it's going to be something that operators have to deal with and work with their respective OEM vendors. So I probably know which company you're referring to about the lock-in. And that's one that we have a lot of challenges with as well, but we're also significantly invested in that company across the majority of our fleet and have been for decades and will be for decades at some of those facilities. So it's a challenge. And the level of integration that we've built on top of those DCSs with the L3 environment for like our advanced control applications, I mean, it just creates a lot of complexity, and it sometimes limits our ability to do things within those environments. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we're talking about right now is, you know, next-gen endpoint protection and the limitations that we have with some of our control system OEMs, because they will not qualify the technology set that we want to use. And so it's not only locking us into control system components, but security features that we depend on to be deployed on top of those control systems.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and I should go a little further with my comments right from before too. If I look, most of our sites are through years worth of acquisitions and mergers and things like that, so they were very independent, right? So all the sites, even within a lot of the sites, there's just several different vendors, right? So the idea of, you know, yes, this vendor coming in and, you know, one vendor to rule them all, right? It's, at least in our environment, just not going to happen. So from the security team's perspective, you know, the OT security team, we're going to look, I want one tool, right? And yes, it is a matter of getting procurement and getting, but we're also, are actually having, it's slow work, but we're having some success working with some vendors to go, okay, look, this is our tool. You don't certify it, but are you willing to work with us and the other vendor to get it certified? And in some cases that's the case. You mentioned next-gen antivirus. So we're looking at or next-gen endpoint protection, right? We're looking at the same type of thing. And, you know, right now there's so many vendors that are locked into, you know, like Symantec and McAfee, let's say, right? And we're looking at somebody, it's like, hey, we want to get this out there. We'll take our time, but let's work with the vendors and slowly get it done. And that's the other thing too, is you know, even internally, one of the things that we're trying to do with, especially the folks that come from the IT side, is go, look, changes are not going to be that quick like they are in IT, right? So understand this is a path that we're on. But, you know, to that point, and the reason that I made that was before is like, yeah, guys, let's just make sure we have as much interoperability with the vendors and, you know, with all the different vendors as possible, because it is going to make your customers' lives a lot easier, right? So, and we'll try to do our part too.
If they're willing to pay for it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And if it's not an RFP,
Yeah.
then you're telling us on the sales side that we're not willing to pay for it.
Yeah.
Okay, that drives R&D decisions, that drives product decisions.
Yeah.
That drives everything else.
Absolutely.
Totally agree.
Okay, there's no other questions. I've got a question. This wasn't one we thought of before, but there's a lot of companies that are interested in providing cybersecurity services. Mm-hmm. Is that what, are you looking for companies to come to you to talk to you about? I mean, not everyone. I don't want this long line of people in your office and me get blamed for it. But I'm just saying, you know, as we were talking here, I got more of an impression. I've been assuming that people are overwhelmed, so you're looking for lots of cybersecurity services. But everything we've kind of talked about here, for the most part, has been more of a why we can't. And I'm not saying what you have to be careful of in what you can do. And it's, you know, and a lot of it is about your internal expertise, your processes, all those kind of stuff. So for the future, do you see it becoming more like, Ricky, in your case, you mentioned, I think, that you're trying to really hire people in more than looking to go out. And that, I mean, so it's not like you're saying, well, like, you know, you've heard of my presentations for years. And I've always been one saying, well, you know, the future is going to be all outsourced kind of stuff. Not perfectly, but at least merging of groups and stuff like that. Where I feel maybe I'm misrepresenting, misunderstanding the situation. Maybe, no, the reality is, no, it's going to be more insourcing and hiring people, and that's more of a challenge. Am I right, or am I missing?
Well, for us,
I just want to give this consultant companies and things like that a sense of what's the opportunities here.
well, I do believe there's going to be a point in the future when we would need to evaluate alternative staffing solutions. We're just not there at this point in time. So the journey that we're on, which is, I mean, it sounds like maybe you're a little bit more mature in some areas, but we're trying to, acquire all the cyber relevant data from the ICS facilities, at scale, and then develop the threat hunting investigations and other processes once we have that data. And so there's a tremendous amount of data that we're going after, and we only have to be honest, we have a fraction of it today from where we want to be in a few years. And because it takes time to gather that information or to gather that data, aggregate it within your SIM. Once we get to that level of maturity and stabilization, then I think we could have a discussion around what makes sense. Do we need to continue staffing up? Are we now looking for more economies of scale? How do we continue to source the team? Because another real challenge that we have is in certain parts of the world, it's very difficult to get this type of talent. I mentioned Budapest. I mean, we have a challenge within Budapest to attract some of the right skills that we're looking for. And, we're really looking on the network security and cyber side over there. And also the domain knowledge from an OT perspective. Eventually, when we go ask a business unit for one of their OT experts, they have their own talent challenges as well from an attrition perspective. Mm-hmm. And so there's going to come a point in time where we're going to be challenged to attract and retain the talent.
Yeah, and it's funny because I tend to think more in terms of just long-term patterns, right? And it seems to me that, and obviously there's patterns on top of patterns, and depending on what you're dealing with, it can be multiple things hitting each other. And I've seen two things right now, right? I feel that, just because I've heard out there, not just in OT, just in general, there seems to be in a lot of companies this more, let's now insource, right? In a few years ago, it was let's outsource. A few years from now, it'll be let's outsource, guys. That type of thing. But what I find interesting too is there's also the combination. At least here, one example is here in the U.S., although I think it's hit elsewhere, is the lack of of people out there to do this right now. So if you're on an insourcing kick, and at the same time you've got a lack of talent, where is that going to end up? And I think that's where you may be selective outsourcing or things like that, right? But yeah, I find that really, kind of interesting because, long term, what is the solution long term, right? And I'm not sure there is a long term, right? It might still be this kind of ebb and flow pattern. What's best to do right now? So,
is there? I know there's a question over there, but 1 minute. I just want to. I'm sorry. I have to follow up on this, but no, there was another comment made here about relationships. And it would seem to me, and Ricky, you're the perfect case here in the sense of you're saying you're not ready for certain things. You're just moving ahead trying to get data and stuff. So it seems to me if I had my own consulting company, if I was John Deloitte or whatever, I would say, hey, let's focus on assessments because the best way to help an ExxonMobil is right now they're looking for information. Assessment in a broad sense, not necessarily. Of getting information, helping them form strategies and stuff like that. And in the process of that, you build this relationship where they learn you, they learn your facilities, you learn them, you build that trust. The next thing that you say, well, we don't, should we be hiring people or should we be outsourcing? Well, Deloitte, again, I'm just not promoting Deloitte, but Deloitte has people, so maybe why do we need to hire a guy who's a specialist in such and such a thing? Why don't we just go to them, But you have that relationship. Is that,
yeah, absolutely.
That's a good strategy for people to be thinking about?
I would say from my perspective, we partner with Deloitte on a lot of opportunities. I mean, and again, because they've established a very strong OT cyber practice, and they have subject matter experts around the world that can help us with various challenges. So if you can afford it and it's the right opportunity, I would definitely recommend, finding a company to partner with. And you may get to that point one day where it's such a trusted relationship and you're having talent acquisition or retainment challenges, and you want to ask a Deloitte, Accenture, or other consulting firm to start to leverage some of the service offerings that they provide, because they do offer services in this space.
As we started the conversation, there is a continuum of services, right? So, and it really depends on where the company is in their maturity. You said, assessments is a good place to start, but as an organization matures and starts to install more and more technology, that technology needs to be managed. And when you start deploying that across the world in facilities around the world that are already understaffed, they're going to need help from somewhere. So it's not an on or off or a binary decision on services. It's more of a continuum.
Yeah, and it's obviously kind of to look at this even in a similar way, or maybe just turn it a little bit. It's like I've always looked at it, and it's like there's really three different types of external things that you would need, right? And that's really more kind of one-time consulting type work, really. Then there's the I'll say more longer term. Let's just take this entire function outsource it to this vendor and let them deal with it, whether that's, tier 1 type support or whether it's something else. And then of course there's really staff augmentation, right? And I think that's where we would get into, especially this type of thing, even if you intend to insource, right? Maybe that's where you go to your vendor partners and goes, I just can't find the talent. Do you have people that can do this for me in a staff aug capacity until I can find it, right? And I know we're doing some of that type of a thing right now. It's more of a combination between, I'll say, project and build work as well as a little bit of staff aug, but we'll see where it all lands. But I think that's really what you have to look at, and what's the best strategy for you, right? So,
Any final words? We've run out. Mark, did you want to say something?
I guess looking at it from a perspective of a utility, I'm always at risk because the utility salaries and like if you could, Digital Boundary Group or Dragos or these other, they're paying their security guys a little more than I'm probably paying my guys right now. So, the idea of saying, you can build loyalty to a certain point, but everybody has to pay some bills. And so from our perspective too, a part of outsourcing isn't the fact as a utility, we're going to always be in that tension of salaries with high-tech rules, and whether it's a guy who can program a DCS or it's a person who actually is going to provide cybersecurity at the higher level, we may always have to look at outsourcing some of those things just from that reality, right?
Okay, I got the cut off kind of a signal out there from somebody. I think he said we had a few minutes to go. So anyhow, I don't know. I'm sorry if I missed any questions. I think Michelle.
One quick question.
Go ahead.
And maybe this won't be a quick question, but how do you guys assess the security effectiveness of your outsourced partners when you go to contract?
That was one of my original issues.
Was that a question you asked already?
No, I didn't ask it. No, it was one of the things on my slides. I'm just saying that's obviously another kind of an issue. Do you guys, is that a short question or somebody want to comment?
that's really short.
Yeah, I don't know if it's, I would say in general, depending on what type of work they're doing, and again, we're not using MSPs for the discussion topic that we've had today, but depending if they're doing sensitive work or highly sensitive type of work, then if they need to be, if they have to demonstrate attestation for compliance with the standard or have the appropriate certifications, we would have those types of discussions to make sure that they were appropriately qualified to do whatever work we're asking of them.
Okay, I guess that's it. And, I hope you join me in thanking the panel. I thought they did wonderful.